It's another glorious day of Illiterate. My name is Evan.
My name is Taylor. I read a book.
I watched a series. This week we're doing Catch-22 by Joseph Heller.
Here we go.
Let's get into it. This is a monster. This is a big one.
Top 100 everything.
This is one that has haunted me for my entire reading life, my literary life, Taylor.
Why is that?
Because in high school, I was finding the books that I wanted to read. I'm finding, the material I'm interested in, the ideas maybe I want to start, following. So I get into books like Fahrenheit 451 and 1984, but this is right up butt next to it, where I'm like, yeah, that's on my list. I buy it. I'm like, okay, yeah, never did it.
Why? It's too big.
A couple times even. I'm like, oh yeah, here we go. Mm-hmm. I have it. It's been sitting on my shelf for a decade. It has to, at least.
I imagine a lot of our listeners have heard of this book. Maybe a few people have read it. But it is in the Moby Dick category of, I should read that. Everybody knows about it.
This is, you should have read it in high school, a la me.
But you watched the Hulu series this week.
I did. I watched the Hulu series, helmed by George Clooney is also in it. It was pretty funny, I have to say. I did not expect this to be as funny as it was, but I think that comedy aspect of it is why it worked so well. But yeah, the series was great. I watched the whole thing, 6 episodes. It's all available right now. People are talking about it. It's hot, and it's good.
So here we go. I listened to the audiobook because it was long and I can't read so much.
But you can't read this. It comes out. I can't read or write.
I listen to a lot of audiobooks. The narrator was real good. Jay Sanders, professional theater actor. He's been in a bunch of movies.
Oh, cool.
He does a lot of different voices. And I felt like was a great addition to the comedy. This is a comedy. Yeah. Because he can do the pacing and the dialogue back and forth, and it's almost like Rick and Morty, where he's the same guy being Rick and Morty and going back and forth in a lot of the interchanges, but does a different voice.
Oh, I bet that helped a lot with this then.
So I was laughing out loud in parts because it felt like I was just listening to two people talk like they should, as opposed to the page. And so I'll get into some of the...
Real quickly, I did it similarly. I didn't sit down and watch the show like moment for moment, but I had it on, so I caught 80% of it. But
like everybody does with The Office.
Right,
it's like
exactly.
In the background.
Exactly. I watched it like that. The main thing is I was really mainlining that dialogue. So I kind of got it in a similar way.
And the style of the book, which is why it's such a monster, is it's all over the place, which as we're talking here, you might get confused. That's the point. I will not rearrange. That's the fun of the book, and a big part of the themes of it being war is crazy, the bureaucracy is crazy, time gets confused.
Yeah.
Stuff is happening all over the place. It's all unchronological, does not follow the straight narrative. Jumps around. There'll be flashbacks that you don't know are flashbacks because somebody's talking about something. It ties into a lot of the comedy because the way that he structures a good majority of the setups and payoffs that I laughed out loud for were events that he talks about as if you already knew that they had happened, so you're familiar with them, and then later on in the story is what actually happened before the thing that they mentioned.
Okay, yeah. This is probably conversely why people also a little bit don't tackle it, because it is supposed to mess with your mind, right? Because that is what it's designed to do. And, and interestingly, as you say, that the show is not like that. There might be tinges of it because it's so inherently part of the material, but for the most part, it is pretty straightforward, which is, as we do these kind of these materials that have series or new pieces of media, it's really interesting to see approaches and how, so like Handmaid's Tale, at least the pilot just nails the tone of that book. And the way it actually reads on the page, whereas Catch-22, I can't imagine that this resembles it at all. On the page.
Yeah. I watched an interview with Joseph Heller, the author, and he was saying he wasn't comparing his work directly to the Bible, but he was just talking about big, expansive pieces of literature are not always designed to be pleasurable in every single instance. You sacrifice something for another thing, and the breadth and scope and the enormity of the narrative is a struggle.
And everything that makes you feel being the byproduct of it.
Yeah. And so the other portion to get into before we get started with the plot to make sense of it is the style of the language of the book. So this is a big part of the story as well. The whole title is based on a paradox. The way that he writes has a lot of repeating phrases. There's circular reasoning for comedic and narrative effect that goes on. Just how deja vu things can be. Sometimes he'll just repeat a scene that already happened earlier in a slightly different way, and you're like, well, I already read this.
I have to say, of all the pieces of war content I've consumed, I've never watched one, I've never digested one that actually made me go, oh yeah, this might be a little bit how I would interpret these situations. Mm-hmm. Just because I think, obviously the comedic tendencies. I would probably be just the absurdity and the tragedy of it all. I'm like, the comedy just made so much sense.
I dug it. I dug it. There's a lot of these classic books that we've read, or I've read thus far, that I'm like, I'm slogging through it, but it's really not for me. This was definitely for me.
Yeah.
The comedy of it. A lot of it was almost like, like a classic screwball comedy.
Right.
Or, like the Three
Where
Stooges.
Horrible, real grounded things happen, but it's the emotion of it is so heightened. The disparity of it all is so heightened. The comedy is just happens. But it really did make me feel, it was like, if me and you were really there on that air base, we
would be clowning.
We would be joking about dying every day. We would just like, how do we get out? And just like laughing about how desperate everybody is to have agency. This is the one that made me go, oh yeah, particularly me, because I know me, I might feel similar to this in this situation.
So the great Harper Lee, I found, said about this book, she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird.
The great Harper Lee, the great.
She said, Catch-22 is the only war novel I've ever read that makes any sense.
Oh, wow. Dang. Okay, yeah, the great. That was
so you
good.
would side with her in that
I do. Yeah, me
well.
And Harper Lee over here sipping my coffee.
It was split by critics. It had been said this is the best novel to come out in years when it first came out. Somebody from the New Yorker said it doesn't seem to have been written, instead shouted onto paper.
This is why I was like, yeah, this would be me.
But it gained a cult following over the years. It came out in 1961. But yeah, we'll talk more about how it came to be and who Joseph Heller is and what in the world any of this means to him.
Okay.
Another thing with the enormosity of it, I counted, and certainly there are probably more, but there are at least 65 named characters in the book.
Wow.
So if I miss out on one of your favorite characters as we're talking about this, I'm not going to go through them all.
Yeah, they might not be in the series then either, because the series does a good job of like having like the
top six or
exactly. Your few cast of characters. There's definitely not room for 65.
And then also same thing with things being so circular and all over the place.
It's not a mistake. It's weird.
Yeah, and I might not get through all of the plot elements, but what I'm more going to try and hit on are the themes that come into play. So the big 4 themes of this book. Language, like we talked about, paradoxes, circular reasoning, back and forth, illogical things. Bureaucracy, in wartime especially, the lack of sense about that, just doing what people tell you because that's what they told you to do. Systems that are in place that people don't understand but follow through on. Death, what that means. Oh. The paradox of that, death versus life, choosing to run away from death versus choosing to go towards life. And then time, and how that gets all mixed up when you're in a place that you don't understand why you're there.
Let's crack this baby open. I'm ready to get weird.
Ready to get weird?
I'm ready to get confused, desperate. I'm ready to scream.
And be silly. This is a silly book.
Who knew? I did not. I never knew it was this silly. I was shocked.
Starts on an island off the coast of Italy, and this is war, supposed to be World War II. And there's this guy, Yossarian, and he's in a hospital in the war. They're all bombers, plane pilots and kind of thing. And he is in this hospital. He's pretending because he doesn't want to fly planes. And that's his whole thing. He's trying to not die in the war, which is the central through line of the whole story in the series. Right.
And immediately I go, oh yeah, of all the war things I've ever, like, that seems to be like the thing that people don't want to focus on is, how do I not die? When it's like, that would be like the main thing that would be on my mind all the time is, how can I make sure I live? Or I don't know. Like I was, it was refreshing to be like that be the central conflict in a character. To be like, how do I literally anything? How do I stay alive?
And it is a refreshing and provocative concept for the time, for sure.
Absolutely,
especially right after World War II, where the idea of a hero is to save others. Yossarian, the main character, his is the exact opposite. How do I save myself? Which is redefining heroism as the preservation of your own life because of the illogical bureaucracy,
the facelessness of it all. Yes.
Yeah. And so then that becomes heroic.
How can you ever have agency? It's the land of the free and home of the brave. But how do you have it? You know, it is a great paradox. It's the American paradox. It's any cultural society paradox of how can I be the country and myself at the same time. And at long and short, you can't. You have to choose at one point or another based on the context or the decision. I'm going to be the American. I'm going to be the countryman. I'm going to be me. I need to choose me. And you can make that choice over and over again, but you do have to choose at some point.
Yeah. So now he's stuck in the hospital. He's doing this thing where they're got to keep him busy, so they're censoring letters that people are writing and sending out. So he's crossing out, sensitive information or whatever, but he doesn't take it seriously at all. He just starts crossing out all the adverbs that he can find. And then he starts crossing out stuff where he's only leaving a, ands, and thes in all of the letters. And then he just starts re-signing things as Washington Irving or Irving Washington, just making stuff up, remarking the letters as these different things.
Oh, man.
There's a guy in there... This is the start of these turns of phrase and logic and paradoxes and all that stuff. And he said he stopped playing chess with this guy because the games were so interesting that they started to become foolish. One of the characters that will reoccur is Dunbar, who's just one of his friends that's also in the hospital pretending to be sick so that he doesn't have to fly. There's another guy that comes in that's the Texan who's so good-natured that nobody could stand him. And next to him is this guy who's they call the soldier in white, and it's just this full-body cast. And all you can see is his mouth.
That's in the show for sure. Hilarious.
And he will come back later as well. Although, I should say that if I say "and then" in this, it could be before, it could be after... I'm not going to make sense of this to you and rejigger all of the plot. I'm going in the order of the book. If you're confused and
going, wait, what, huh? That's exactly...
that already happened?
You're not confused at all. You're right there. You're on it.
Yeah. There's a chaplain who comes in who's the spiritual leader. He represents how this affects one's spiritual life and how that starts to also not make sense. Morals, good and bad. So he says the Texan ended up driving everybody from the ward. And the only person that was left was this investigative detective in the army that got a cold. So the one guy that's not supposed to be actually got sick and has stayed there. He'll come in later. Everybody gets mad when Yossarian mentions the war, especially this guy Clevinger, because he keeps saying, nobody's trying to kill you. Because Yossarian, his logic is, everybody's trying to kill me. But Clevinger's like, not you specifically.
Right.
But Yossarian is like, it doesn't matter. If it's me, everybody's trying to kill me. He takes it very personally, which Clevinger doesn't really believe in.
Well, it could be him. How do I figure out how it's not going to be me? How do I take myself out of the equation?
Yeah.
Where does that equation start?
Yeah. And Yossarian's like, well, I got poisoned. And Clevinger's like, no, everyone got poisoned. And we wonder how that happened or where that fits into the timeline. Yossarian has a roommate named Orr, which the guy in the audiobook does with a lisp and kind of a doofy, like constantly out to lunch kind of guy who's just working on making their tent as nice as possible and built this wood stove and a floor and all this stuff. And he says there's a dead man that's also in their tent.
There's a dead man?
So he says there's a dead man who's also in their tent. We come to find out later that it's just the dead guy's stuff. But it's I guess like a metaphor for how that person is there, even though they're not there. It's the presence of this person who's dead that just they can't take away because of the bureaucracy of later on what happened. You realize is this guy got transferred and then accidentally went to the operations tent trying to figure out where he was supposed to put his stuff, but he put his stuff in their tent and then the operations just sent him off instead of getting him checked in appropriately, and then he died in that flight 2 hours later. So technically he wasn't registered to be in the thing, so they can't take his stuff away either. Wow. So it's just his dead stuff that they have to keep in his tent. And so they just say, well, there's a dead guy living with us. But it's very confusing when you first read the book because they don't mention his body or anything. You're like, is there like a ghost? Is there an actual person? But that ties into the absurdity of the whole thing. There's a guy named
that's a beautiful, that's just a beautiful example of the absurdity, the tragedy, and the comedy of this whole thing tied up into just one kind of image.
And there are 65 of those different nuanced takes on it. Yeah. There's a guy named McWatt who flies too low all the time, which ends up being his undoing later on if we get to that. And just these backwards logic of, like, he trusts Orr, his roommate, so much. He says Orr was right because to the best of his knowledge, he had never been wrong. And that's how you know he was right. There's this guy named Milo who runs the mess hall, which I don't know if he's in the series very prevalently.
Yeah, there's like one whole episode all about how insane, like Milo's insane adventures, so he pops which was a little bit of like, it opens up the world even a little bit more, and you go off and I'm like, what in the world is going on?
This place is absurd.
No, I know. And so that character is like, please,
so we just see him in the first part of the book. He's running the mess hall, and that's all we really know about him. And then you start to learn more about him, and you're like, oh my goodness, who is this guy? The doctor is Doc Danica, and so he's the guy that can ground you and say you can't fly. And so Yossarian has a lot of back and forth with this guy. He's kind of also a shady moral character who is clearly doing illegitimate doctorly activities back in Long Island and is constantly complaining about how people are out to get him or up against him. And it's like, dude, you were doing all of these wrong things. Yeah.
Because you're doing terrible things.
Yeah. But now he's stuck in the war like everybody else. So he tells Yossarian that the Colonel wants them to do 50 missions instead of 45. So this is a constant reoccurring element in the book and is really the only way to ground you in where you are chronologically.
Yeah.
Is if they ever mention the number of missions that they have to be doing. And you're like, oh, so this must have happened before because they went from 30 to 40 missions. Now that's what he has to do.
Yeah, and in the show, that's followed pretty A to B to C.
Yeah, it's kind of all over the place. So now we know, it was 45, and now they need him to do 50. So it's the Colonel Cathcart is the main guy that is in charge of their squadron or what have you. And he's the one that keeps upping the missions. So the doctor at this point is also, for whatever reason, because of the bureaucracy, he also has to have so many missions, but they just write his name on the logs that he went on these missions, but he doesn't actually go, which comes in way later, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
Which, this is one of the things that I love. Even though the book is such a monster, that's where a lot of the comedy comes in. There'll be a little mention of something, and then chapter 37, 359 pages later, you're like, oh, that had major repercussions in the logic of this story.
That,
because it was so illogical at the beginning.
And so sometimes the payoffs and the setups and payoffs are switched around even, where that's interesting. I love that. That's cool.
We get a clue into this guy, Major, who becomes huge, and
I love.
You told me it was one of your favorite, And I don't know if this is in the show, but they say he looks like Henry Fonda in distress, which also comes back. So Henry Fonda was a famous actor at the time, but nobody really cares about Henry Fonda anymore.
Henry Fonda was, but like I'm trying to. I don't know what they looked like well enough to go like, oh yeah, that character looks like Henry.
So if you want a modern reference, you could just say it's as if he looked like George Clooney in distress, like a George Clooney kind of person. And there was a movie version of Catch-22 that came out in the 70s. Had a lot of big name actors of the time. It took 2 years for them to write the script. Joseph Heller approved it. He said there was even some dialogue and stuff he wished he'd put in his novel. Didn't do very well commercially because MASH came out the same year. And also Vietnam War is happening. People are not wanting to learn about war stuff, even if it's critical of it. But it had Alan Arkin was the main guy, Yossarian. A very young Alan Arkin. It had Art Garfunkel from Simon and Garfunkel. Had John Voight in it. Martin Sheen, Orson Welles. All kinds of people. Yeah. And then the guy who directed it did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, The Graduate, and The Birdcage.
Okay, so not that much. No, I'm just kidding.
So there's a lot of stuff. But the guy that they picked to play Major in that didn't look like Henry Fonda. They didn't make the jokes about Henry Fonda. But even if you don't know who Henry Fonda is, it keeps coming up how people confuse him for Henry Fonda.
That's hilarious. I love that. I don't think that's in the show.
Yeah.
And maybe somebody will be correct. Again, I was listening to the dialogue for most of it, but I'm like, I don't know.
But I don't think it's a modern, relevant thing that people would care about. But it's just so it ties into Major's character in the book because he is the most milquetoast neutral person of all time. The fact that not only does he become the Major, which we'll get into through spurious means, he also looks like somebody that's really successful and famous that people confuse him for, which he has no business being a part of. So he looks like Henry Fonda in distress. Or goes off on this weird diatribe, which is his roommate, that's kind of weird, about how he liked to stuff crab apples in his cheeks. And Yossarian is like, why did you like to do this? And Orr goes on this logical train that makes absolutely no sense of how he's like, because they're better than chestnuts. And he's like, well, why did you walk around with anything in your mouth? And he's like, I didn't walk around with anything. I walked around with crab apples in my cheeks.
Why?
And he's like, why? He's like, because I wanted big cheeks. And he's like, why? And he's like, because, you know, like there's people that have rubber balls in their hands to like strengthen them.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, what does that have to do with anything? And he's like, well, I did that so that, you know, I could protect my reputation so that people wouldn't look at the fact that I had crab apples in my cheeks. And he was like, it was tough to explain the rubber balls, though, because I had crab apples in my cheeks. And you never learn why he did this at all.
Well, that sounds like a real conversation with somebody, and you can't get them to understand exactly what you're asking them. And you're asking them about something that they don't actually understand either. And they're trying to, like...
It just becomes another excuse for another thing, which is part of the bureaucracy of war. You just do things because it's the excuse because you did that, because you did that. And
because the machine must move on and then the job must get done. And, you know...
And you just accept it.
And that's where somebody like Yo-Yo comes in and says, well, I don't want it to be me. How can I game the system and get out? Well, you know, next person in line. Because it's all faceless and it doesn't matter because we'll send a doctor who came out to do this off to the front lines immediately because we didn't check him in and nobody can touch his stuff now, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, because of all this, because there's so much not paying attention going on, what does it matter if it's me in the seat or not when the plane goes, you know, like, I'm like, I totally understand his thought process to a degree, like, absolutely. And it's just, again, back to, it's refreshing to actually see a soldier not doing the best, being the countryman.
And for some, again, not many people were really thinking this after World War II.
Absolutely.
Just keep...
But, conversely, this comes out 1960 what? Because we get in the counterculture here. But by the time the 60s are actually coming around, you have both. You have the hippie culture is actually coming to a head. Those people are aging into actual agency. And then you have everybody else who is already an adult who says that's absolutely wrong. So it's kind of a cataclysm of the hippie culture mashup in the 60s is happening almost right within the content of this book. That's actually kind of fascinating.
So here's what happens with the history of it. Joseph Heller was a bombardier during World War II. Says that it was the most fun he's ever had. I don't know if that's a direct quote, but he was not dismissive of that experience in this book. He flew 60 missions in 1944. He's 21 years old. Wow. The war ends. He doesn't start writing the book until 53, so not like while he's within it or whatever. But
that's interesting to me because it's not like this stuff is not inspired from what actually happened in and around him and his friends and his relationships during that time. But it took him a long time to actually get it.
So it was written between 53
and
1961. So it took him 8 years to write it. In that time, he was getting his degree. He went to a bunch of different schools. He went to USC, he went to NYU, he went to Columbia.
Make up your mind.
Well, because of the Army, he was able to... They paid for it or whatever.
His whole life's like this book.
He worked as an ad copywriter.
Oh.
And in that time, wrote one chapter and submitted it to a magazine, and then didn't touch the story for another year. His agent was like, oh, well, you should write this into a whole thing. They said, we'll give you $750 up front and then $750 when it's done. And then, of course, he missed the deadline by another 5 years because it came out in 61. But the movie and royalty rights made him a millionaire after all of that. But he said the anti-war feelings came from, in the time he was writing it, the Korean War and the Cold War of the 50s, not his experience in World War II. And that's why it hit the cultural touch point of the Vietnam War, and why every kid in college had it in their arms, because it came out in 61. But the setting is World War II. So we talked about this doctor, Doc Danica, who's this shisty guy. He says Doc Danica was his friend and would do just about nothing to help him. Playing off of typical phrases and wordplay. And just, I love the characterization of some people. There's this character named General Dreedle, the type of person who always wrote enhanced when he meant increased. Just like being a little bit too fancy. There's this guy named Havermeyer, who's another soldier, who he said never took evasive action. He just always flew straight through, which is counter to Yossarian, who flings and flies all over the place. He's like, I don't care if we drop a single bomb. I'm not going to get hit. Yeah. And people are jostling about the cabin and whatnot. No regard for the bombs whatsoever. Yossarian was a collector of good questions. There's a guy named Captain Black, who he's the intelligence guy, and they have these intelligence meetings. Whenever he opened up the floor for questions, people asked such great questions, like, who is Spain? Why is Hitler? When is right? Where is that stooped man I used to call father when the merry-go-round broke down? And balls. Just
great question.
And then, wonderful. But Yossarian said, where are the Snowdens of yesteryear? Which nobody wants to talk about, which is some guy that died. And this is the first piece we get of, as the story builds, if there ever was a true climax of it, this is the climax of understanding what happened with this Snowden character, because as a repeating element, it keeps coming back, and there keeps being smaller pieces okay, well, why is Yossarian asking this question? We learn later he does know a little bit about it. It is haunting him. Then Colonel Korn, spelled with a K for some reason, starts... Like the band. Like the band. Maybe they stole it from here. Starts saying, and here's one of the kind of paradoxes, is he says, the only people that are now permitted to ask questions are the people that never have, and so the meetings get canceled because nobody asks any questions, and there's no intelligence to deliver. There's a metaphor in the fact that they start doing skeet shooting, and Dunbar, who is his best friend, shoots skeet because he says the boring stuff takes a long time and it makes your life feel longer. And so that's why he does it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's so in the same mindset where Yo-Yo is like, how do I don't want it to be me. How do I get out of here? How do I get out of the game?
Dunbar's
somebody else who's just locked into the game, but trying to enhance the moment as much as they can, even to the point where it's like, I'm not even going to enjoy it. I just want it to feel like more.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So there's so many different angles. There's a guy named Wintergreen who's in the office, and he's on the phone, or he's picking up to call the superiors, and some guy is saying, it's easy to make money. It's hard not to make money. And they're like arguing about who's a poet that made money. And so he's on the phone and he just says, T.S. Eliot, and then hangs up. And this is part of the information and technology and bureaucracy and all that stuff. And they're like, who called? We don't know. What did they say? They just said T.S. Eliot. And so then they call their superior and they're like, is there a code? And they're like, is there a code called T.S. Eliot? And they're like, no. And they're like, well, call him back. And so then they call them back and just say T.S. Eliot. And they're like, well, what did he say? He said T.S. Eliot. What does that mean? And everybody gets so confused and it starts this panic about what codes are. And
this is our brand of comedy.
Though. Yeah. Exactly. So that's a whole section because
we often talk about how things can just go erratically awry with the slightest of nudge. And so it's funny, the way that these red tapes of these systems are set up, the bureaucracy of it all, but it's like it's incredibly fragile. Like it is man-made and fragile, and
from 20,000 feet up, hilarious. Yeah. The Doc Danica goes into how they ended up pulling him to be able to go into service. He wrote in to the army saying he was unfit for service as a doctor. He's like, yeah, I said I had one leg amputated. I was bedridden with arthritis. They still sent this guy around to check on me, and I got sent to the army. He said, we live in an age of distrust, of our values. The word of a licensed physician, even though it was me, was even distrusted because he wrote his own report saying he couldn't join the army. He's like, what have we come to that they can't even trust the word of a licensed physician? There's a guy named Chief Half-Oat, and his story that he presents is the way that he got into the army is he was on land and they found oil, and he's like a human divining rod because then he got moved, and then wherever he moved, they found oil there. Like he's putting the cart before the horse and being like, they just kept following us, and wherever we landed next, like moving around the United States, they found oil. So then we had to move, and then they found oil there. And so he thinks that he is the reason that they found oil. And he's like, there was so much racial prejudice. It's terrible. Treating an Indian like, and then uses all of these racial slurs for the other races.
I like it.
And so then they move him to Colorado, which is where the army training is, which is where we realize a lot of these guys met up. Yossarian met up.
Yeah.
Wintergreen met up. These other people met up. So then Yossarian is trying to figure out, he's like, oh, well, they can ground people who are crazy. And this is where the title comes in and Catch-22 and all of that stuff. So he's going to talk to the doctor, and he's saying, ask Clevinger. He'll tell you I'm crazy. And the doctor's like, he's crazy. And it's like,
why don't you send him home?
Yeah, and so yeah, exactly.
But anybody who asks isn't crazy, because of course they'd want to get out of war.
You can't let the crazy people decide. So that's a catch-22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat duty isn't really crazy, and so they have to fly. But all you have to do is ask.
But then that means you're not crazy.
But then that means you're not crazy. So what a catch-22 is...
By this logic, they need to send all these pilots home right now.
The very definition of a catch-22 is a problem for which the only solution is denied by a circumstance inherent in the problem. So, for example, you lose something, and that requires you to find it, the solution to the problem. But if you lost your glasses, how do you find them? Because you need them to find what you lost. But what if you lost were your glasses?
Whoops.
How are you going to find them? Right? So the author, Joseph Heller, he would say... when somebody would come up to him and give an example, he would grumble off to the side. He's like, that's not a catch-22. They almost never are. Whenever anybody tries to come up with one.
Right.
It doesn't just mean irony, or it doesn't just mean a paradox. And to him also, he would even say that like the glasses one is not a catch-22. It's got to be a high-stakes, life and death kind of thing. But now... it's in the lexicon.
Absolutely.
And this is where it came from. I don't know. I certainly didn't know that that was the case, that this is what created that term. He didn't steal it from anything else and name it.
I assumed it was something he came across in real life and then put into the book, and it's just something that nobody had ever actually committed to word.
Right.
That's what I assume. But,
no, he came up with it. The story behind the title, for the 8 years that he was writing it, he had it called Catch-18, and that's just what he wanted. 18 is a lucky number, but just as he was about to publish it, another novel about World War II had just come out and was called Mila 18, and he wanted it to be Catch-18. And Mila 18 was number 7 on the New York Times bestsellers list, and they were like, we can't have two books about World War II with 18 in the title of a two-word title. Yeah. So then...
the second word of a 2-word title.
Yeah. So they were like, okay, well, let's call it Catch-11, because they like the idea of a repeating number, 1 and 1. And Joseph Heller, in an interview, was saying, he was like, this is the only other number with a vowel sound at the beginning. So 18 and 11. And he liked the way that flowed. But... the original Ocean's 11 movie just came out months before.
No.
And so you can't have Catch-11 and Ocean's 11.
Echoes of George Clooney, though.
Yeah, there he is. He's in all this. So then they were like, well, let's do Catch-17. Fine, we'll do Catch-17. But that was close. There was a comedy drama war film in a prisoner of war camp, very similar, and that was called Stalag 17. So like, we can't do that. So then they said, well, let's just do Catch-14. They like that. And then the publisher was like, no, 14's not a funny number.
We don't like that one.
Yeah. So then they were like, 22. And he's like, that's it. That's it. There it is.
Print it.
And then there it was, and there it is now forever.
Wow.
So they tried 7 different numbers before
Some
they got
catch
to
that Catch-22.
And that's the famous phrase. That's the famous phrase.
That's amazing. I always assumed it was just something he had come across in real life and put into a book, but actually even it was bureaucracy. That's hilarious, actually, and quite beautiful. And if you really break it down, then the title itself is a product of the exact thing that this novel is trying to pick apart.
Yes, no, fine, no.
Compromise for no reason. Let's do it.
Sure, whatever.
We can't do that.
And there it is.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Keep going on. His roommate Orr talks about this guy named Appleby, and they have this huge argument. Orr, again, with his madness logic about the crab apples in his thing. He's like, Appleby's got flies in his eyes. Yossarian's like, no, he doesn't. And Orr is like, well, how can he see that he's got flies in his eyes if he's got flies in his eyes? And he's, again, talking about how Orr is so truthful. He's like, Orr has never lied to him, unlike his mother, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, teacher, neighbor, newspaper. So then, Appleby, word gets around that he's got flies in his eyes. So Appleby's starting to freak out. So they're like driving somewhere, and he's like, Havermeyer, have I got flies in my eyes? And Havermeyer's like, no. Appleby says to Havermeyer, because he's eating something, he's like, well, you've got crumbs on your face. And Havermeyer's like, well, I'd rather have crumbs on my face than flies in my eyes. And now he's just paranoid for the rest of the book. That he's got flies in his eyes and he can't see them. He doesn't know, and nobody's telling him.
Do I have flies in my eyes?
And then we hit kind of another serious point with Yossarian in the cockpit, and we know that Snowden was lying in the back dying, saying, help him. Like, oh, so this is who this Snowden person is, that he was saying, what happened to Snowden? It's like, well, he was with you in a plane, and he died, and he was in the back saying to help him? Why are you asking the question of what happened to him? Circulating in his mind. So, this is one of my favorite characters, is this guy named Hungry Joe, which I read somewhere that Joseph Heller, that was his nickname in World War II.
Oh, cool.
That's like one of the only things he directly says, yeah, this is based
real,
on this.
That's cool.
Because it's an amalgamation of his experience. So Hungry Joe does have 50 missions done. He's done it. And they're like, Hungry Joe asked to go home. But he's crazy, so he doesn't ask. And he's always hearing things. Sounds bother him so much. He's like, you got to roll your watch in your socks, woolen socks, before you go to bed. Like any small sounds. He's always just screaming in the middle of the night. But it's okay because he set his tent up in the wrong area, so he's like far away on the other side of the railroad tracks.
That's just people. Hungry Joe screaming about all his mistakes.
Mm-hmm. He's a little bit of a perv because he's always trying to take naked pics of women.
Oh.
But
no.
He's like going up to the big screen and like trying to take an upskirt shot.
What does he have? Like one of the big flash cameras with like a Jesus. This is not.
Well, and the way that
like they have Polaroids. Like, come on.
The way that he seduces
a few years out.
The way that he seduces women is like he says he pretends to be a Life magazine photographer, and the irony in the story that the narrator says is that he was in real life before the war. He was a Life magazine photographer.
Oh, so he wasn't. I love it. That's hilarious.
Yeah. And there was a point that they find out.
You can't just go around pretending. Well, I am. You can't just pretend.
There was a time where Hungry Joe had 25 missions, and that was enough to leave. But Colonel Cathcart raised it up, so now it's gotten to the point where he had gotten up to 50.
But he still doesn't ask.
Dr. Nika goes on this.
He's got to screaming to do it.
He's got screaming to do. Alone in his tent. Dr. Nika goes into this tirade about he's like, I'm telling you, it was $50K a year tax-free. They paid in cash just when I needed it. I was sent.
I love that.
And he's trying to get out of doing these flying missions by writing his name. Appleby. They're talking about how Appleby is the best ping pong player with flies in his eyes. He's never lost a serve. Just little bits that they set up and pay off or call back to.
Oh, that's
that like
so
from
funny.
now on he's just got flies in his eyes. Every time they mention him again, no matter what he is, he's the best with flies in his eyes. So we realize that this Chief Half-Oat guy has his roommate is named Captain Flume, and they say Captain Flume is obsessed with the idea that Chief Halfo is going to tiptoe to him in his cot in the middle of the night and slit his throat from ear when he's sound asleep. And then the very next sentence, he got this idea from Chief Wife Halfo, who did tiptoe to him in the middle of the night and hiss in his ear that he was going to slit his throat when he was sound asleep. And and he asks Chief Halfo why, and he says, "Why not?" And this is the logic of war and the madness of it. And so then,
why would you do this?
He stays awake all night, every night, because he never can go to sleep. But what actually happens is he just dreams that he's awake, and so he's exhausted all the time.
Oh my gosh. I think that's what actually happens to me. I tell Emily all the time, I don't dream. I've told everybody this my entire life. I don't dream. I just go to sleep and I wake up immediately, and it's the next morning.
And he's exhausted.
I've just been dreaming I'm awake.
And so Captain Flume is off the deep end for the rest of the story because of Halfo's just nonsense for no reason.
That's amazing.
It's hard, but like that kind of writing happens every paragraph. Like it's well written. It's funnily well written.
Oh gosh.
There's a point where they're playing basketball and Major is there, and the general rolls up and is like, "You're the new squadron commander, and don't think it means anything, because it doesn't, except you're the new squadron commander." And so then everybody treats him differently. So he had 3 strikes against him. That for some reason they just like go way back in history to kind of like the origins of Major for one of these chapters. There was 3 strikes against him: his mom, his dad, and Henry Fonda. Because he looks too much like him. His dad made so much money not making alfalfa because the government subsidized him.
Okay, yeah.
He was not growing more alfalfa than anyone in the country. Just the way that it's written, the reverse, amazing.
But see, they keep a lot of those turn of phrase in the show. It's really funny, and because it's George Clooney's sensibilities eking throughout the screen, even when he's
mixed
nowhere
with kind of
around.
Like the Coen brothers.
Yes, exactly. So it really worked. It was really great. But I'm just eating up this writing though. This is so funny.
Yeah. So then he goes into how his dad, who made more money not growing alfalfa than anyone, waited for this moment to like name his son, and he said a weaker man would have wasted the opportunity, calling him Drum, Minor, Sergeant, or even C Sharp. He said he wasn't going to waste it. He named him Major. And then it was only in kindergarten that Major learned that his middle name was also Major. So he's Major. And which just completely ostracized him in kindergarten. He never had a friend. But he goes through all of these qualities of Major, and it's just all the 10 commandments that he doesn't. He's like, he didn't covet his neighbor's ass. He didn't take the Lord's name in vain. And you're just like, oh, this is just the 10 commandments.
It's all the banter they did at the mess hall at the table. That's amazing. That's funny though, because that scene does play out with Major in the show when they're at the basketball hoop. They come to get him because he's not reporting to some meeting that he needs to be on, and this is where they realize they've promoted him based on his name.
Right.
Not because of his rank, but they cannot take back his promotion because the decision's been made and he's on all the rosters and all the paperwork has been done since 1945. And it's like, and he's late for the meeting that he's on paper for right now.
Yeah.
So the whole rest, but it all happens right there on the basketball field, and they're realizing it when he's explaining, well, my dad thought it was really funny. So like, and he explains all this in front of the whole basketball crew.
Gotcha.
Well, they've rolled up in a Jeep. It's like, you're late to the meeting, Major. It's like, I'm not a major, but you're Major. So they also paint this portrait of him, like I said, just being the most like mediocre person. People were impressed by how unimpressive he was. That's his life. So the fact that he becomes the most important person through a fluke is again because of his look.
This bureaucracy, language, all of that stuff. Yeah, and he looked like Henry Fonda.
The look, the name, and boom, boom, boom.
Yeah. He was promoted because of a computer mistake, and yeah, he was playing, like I said, he was playing basketball. The team fluctuated between 1 and 35 people, so he could just kind of, fade into the background. People who hardly noticed he looked like Henry Fonda, it was all they talked about from then on. It says that he started forging the Washington Irving names because he heard some guy in the hospital was doing that, because he thought it was fun, because they kept giving him documents to sign.
Oh, yeah.
And all he would do was sign his name, Major, and then it would come back to him from another department needing to re-sign it, and some document ended up being this giant manuscript. And he found that if he wrote Washington Irving, it never found his desk again. It just disappeared into the bureaucratic ether. So he just started writing Washington Irving on everything. Man.
So it disappears.
Yeah. And he was like, it was fun to write.
Hilarious.
It was more fun than his name. There's another investigative detective person who comes in and interrogates him and is like, who's writing this? And so he pawns it off and is like, well, I think the chaplain was. So now the chaplain for the rest of the story is in hot water. They think the chaplain is forging Washington Irving on things, even though he got the idea from Yossarian in the hospital. Major did. But now Major is just hiding from everyone. That's his whole shtick. Is because he looks like Henry Fonda, and everybody wants him because he's the head guy, but he just hides in the office. And he's wondering how this major named de Coverly works, because there's this old guy that just is in the back and only plays horseshoes and doesn't do anything, this old white-haired dude. And this is the first instance you really get about this guy. And this is what Major wants. How does this major? And in the book, so the way that the audio book is, he does de Coverly, but it's just 2 dashes de Coverly. Like, they don't say his first name because nobody knows who he is.
Yeah.
How do they do that in the...
I don't remember how they did it in Catch-22 exactly.
They might just call him Major de Coverly.
They probably did. Yeah, that never jumped out at me like that. It's funny though. I was rewatching Vice, the Dick Cheney movie last night, and they posit a scene where he's supposed to be meeting with people and to make some deal happen with the Halliburton and the oil industry or whatever, except all of that stuff would be redacted, so they don't know who he met with exactly, or somebody does, except it's redacted. So they play out the scene with blurred faces, and when they say, "Oh, nice to see you again," beep, yeah. So it's similarly. So they could have done something like that in Catch-22, but that never jumped out.
That never jumped out. It jumped out here because they don't know who this guy is. He's like the head honcho guy, but he's actually not doing anything. He just found a way to just play horseshoes all day.
Right.
And nobody knows who he is. So
he found a way to disappear in the machine. That's the ultimate.
So this CID guy who they're like, well, who's this Washington Irving guy? He's like, why are you in a bathrobe and slippers? And he was like, oh, I was in the hospital. I got a cold, which was the first thing we heard about at the very beginning. It was that guy that was investigating stuff and then caught a cold. So then he jumps out the window because that's the only way you can get out of Major's office is jumping out the window. And then so then another CID man comes in and who wonders like, hey, who's that guy that was jumping out the window? And he's like, oh, that's a CID man. Wondering about this Washington Irving. So now there's 2 guys. Like the one CID guy is following the other CID guy because it's suspicious that he was jumping out the window. So Major, dips out of his office, runs through the forest, sees Captain Flume in the forest hiding from Chief Haffo because he's afraid that he's going to slit his from ear to ear.
I'm gonna sleep over in the middle of the night and slit your throat from ear to ear. Why would you do this? Why not?
As Major is running through the forest and seeing Captain Flume, Yossarian hits him with a flying tackle, and he says this is the last person that he wanted to be brought down with a flying tackle. Was Yossarian. And so Yossarian gets an audience with him. He says, please jump into my office. They jump through the window. And he's explaining, like, I can't fly anymore. And Major's like, well, suppose everybody felt that way. And he's like, well, if everybody felt that way, then I'd be a fool to feel any other way. But he can't do anything. Major, caught up in the bureaucracy, can't do anything. We learn about Wintergreen, who was the guy that said the T.S. Eliot thing and got the whole ruckus about the information. He was sent to dig holes in cadet school in Colorado, And that was because he kept on going AWOL from the training. And so they're like, dig a hole and then refill it. Dig a hole and then refill it. And that's all he's doing. But he's like, I'm doing something for my country. Again, insanity. You're not accomplishing anything.
Yeah.
Half-Oat shows up there. Wintergreen is digging a hole, nicks a pipe, and they think it's oil. So then that's why Half-Oat and Wintergreen get shipped off. And that's why Half-Oat is like, everywhere I went, there's oil.
It's me! It's me! It's always been me! But they drag him away.
So I love how all of these little elements that like I said, the payoff becomes the setup.
Yeah. As
the payoff, even though it was the setup for the other thing that these people think. And then they say, oh, there's Appleby, and he thought he saw Henry Fonda jump out of the office, and because he wants to go see Major about something, and his secretary is like, well, you can go in now during lunch, because he never sees anybody in his office while he's in his office. Those are the orders. You can ask Major when you see him.
When can I see him?
But he's never going to see him.
Because he's never in the office. When he is in the office, you're not allowed to see him.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there.
Thank you.
That is going to be... This is a two-parter, ladies and gentlemen.
For sure.
This is a two-parter. This is the end of part 1. So we are going to pick it right back up right here in part 2. If you will go and find that, it should be available right now. Hey everybody, this is Illiterate. This is part 2 of our Catch-22 episode. We're gonna jump right in. Taylor, you ready?
Here we go. Listen to part 1. Don't listen to this. You'll be halfway through and be confused.
If you're confused, go back and listen to part 1 right now.
Here we go. So now we're in this new section where we kind of are going more in chronological. Things get a little bit more serious, although there's still elements of levity and humor. At a certain point, Dr. Nika gives Yossarian, there's orders that he can give him all the fruit he wants, because that will help his liver, because that was the excuse he was in the hospital, but he doesn't have a problem with his liver, and if he eats this fruit, it's going to help him. So he just keeps it, and then gives it away, and Milo is like, what are you doing? You're just giving all this fruit away. Yeah. He's like, well, there'd be one. He's like, you're just giving it away? They keep mentioning, like with Appleby with flies in his eyes, Milo's unfortunate mustache.
Oh, yeah.
He just has an unfortunate mustache. And every time they mention Milo, they just keep talking about his unfortunate mustache. So Milo is trying to explain this plan that he has, and he rips off this guy's bed sheet, and he's trying to explain redistributing this bed sheet to Clevinger and to Yossarian about this idea he has for selling food, and that why aren't they giving away this fruit, selling it? And if you have a quarter of a bed sheet, we all get a piece of it, and this is for the syndicate, and I'll have a mart, and everybody will have shares, and it's just a madness. Nobody can understand what he's saying, and the other guy's like, but I still just have half a bed sheet. That's the important thing, is you rip my bed sheet in half. I don't care about trying to explain your economic schemes of like, but you're the one buying the fruit back from yourself. It's just insane. And I won't go into any, because it doesn't make sense at all. But he's like, this is what he's doing. And they're like, sure, whatever. A big scene I know that happens in the series is this character, Scheisskopf, which is the George Clooney character. Yeah. Which I'd be remiss if we didn't mention that. It's this lieutenant who's obsessed with parades as part of the bureaucracy of everything.
Tight formations. Beautiful formations.
At the expense of, it's a huge deal. His wife is cheating on him with everyone. And she just wants him to do stuff to her. And he's like, he says, I don't have the time. I don't have the time.
Oh my God.
There it was, Sunday already, and only 7 days left in the week to get ready for the next parade. So he comes up with this scheme.
He's so great as the character. Yeah. He really is. It was so funny just to see him go way over the top of just like a military general. But what he's really doing is directing theater. Mm-hmm. It was really
all he cares about is the parades. Yeah. And he's saying he found this thing, part of the rules of the parades is about the swinging of the hands. Yeah. And in the dead of night, he's like teaching them how to not swing their hands. So you can win this colored pennant if you have the red pennant. And he won it 2 weeks in a row. This is at the training that Yossarian and Wintergreen and Half-Oat and all those people are. That's what he's doing. So you realize, oh, well, this is a flashback to when they were in training.
So like in the first episode, they're in training. He's like trying to teach the new cadets like how to swing your arms 4 inches, all that whole thing.
Yeah.
And then at the very end, you're back there, and somebody's coming to, like some general or something is coming to visit them, and he kind of goes off in this trail of like his own like admiration of like, this man came from all the way from Ohio because he heard about your tight formations. Your beautiful form, like he just goes into it.
Yeah, they say in the book, they're like, he was a military genius. It was a shame about his wife. So he's involved in this scene in the Hulu series, which is also a big part of and a well-known point in the story. Kind of like the who's on first, what's on second, mixing up turns of phrase.
Yeah.
And it's Clevinger, who's one of the other guys, and he's on trial. And it's this entire kangaroo court situation where he's on trial for something that he said or didn't say, and they all get confused with each other. Scheisskopf, which is the George Clooney character in the book, is not the person administering the trial. He's the prosecutor. And then there's this other unnamed colonel that's the guy yelling and screaming and causing a problem. And so just some of the language that comes from that, they're trying to punish him for something that he said. And they're getting all mixed up with each other and who said what. And the colonel's like, when did we say we couldn't punish you? And Clevinger's like, I never said you couldn't punish me. And he's like, no, now you're telling us when you did say it. I'm asking you when you didn't. And Clevinger says, I always didn't say you couldn't punish me. And then the colonel's like, thanks, though that's a lie. You whispered to that guy. And then like, Yossarian, what kind of a name is Yossarian? And then Lieutenant Scheisskopf had the facts at his fingertips. It's Yossarian's name. Yes, I suppose it is, he said.
Hot with the fact.
Yeah. And then I think this is even in the trailer. He says, where were we? Read me back the last line.
Yeah.
And the notes guy says, read me back the last line.
No, not my line.
The last line.
No, that was the last line. I read the line back to you.
No, a different line. Not my line or your line. Yeah. Yeah, he says, don't call me sir, and say sir when you don't. And then Clevinger was guilty, of course. And then Yossarian warned him about all this beforehand, and he's like, you don't have a chance. They hate Jews. And Clevinger's like, but I'm not Jewish. And Yossarian says, it won't make a difference. And he was right. Yeah. So that's the whole thing. It became... Joseph Heller turned it into a one-act play. Oh. That scene rewrote it as a play.
Oh, yeah.
And if you look it up on YouTube, there's a ton of like high school drama productions and other things. There's not really a good version that I saw. I'll put a link to one of them.
Sure.
But
that's neat. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like a full 20, 30 minute, its own kind of performance.
Oh, cool.
Because it's so well written as like a comedy of errors, of miscommunication.
Oh, I love that.
And somebody trying to represent themselves.
I love they made it into a little one act. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that as a huge...
Oh yeah, the scene is incredible. It's so funny. Yeah.
It's probably one of the most memorable elements of the book.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was laughing out loud listening to it, especially because he's doing all the different voices. So now we're back at part 2 where we're talking about the chronological order of what's going on. We get back to the very, very beginning, which is the initial bombing of Bologna. And this is before the start of the story where Yossarian decides he's going to pretend to be in the hospital because he's sick.
Got you.
They have the orders, they're going to bomb it. There's the line of where their troops how far they've progressed. And they're talking about the absurdity of when they're going to go, and it's raining, and it's crazy, and Clevinger's like, it makes as much sense as if someone tiptoed in the middle of the night to move the bomb line on the map over Bologna. So that's right, what Yossarian does. He tiptoes over to the line in the middle of the night and moves it over, and the generals that are in charge see that the line has moved, and they go call the superiors, and they're like, oh, well, we don't have to go because we're on the front, and we did it, right? And so the word spreads and people get medals, and then they realize, like, wait, we didn't do it. Like, nobody actually went, but they keep the medal. And this is also when Major de Coverley, like, that's his thing. That's why he always stays alive, because he just goes to where the next front is, and he's always there. So they said moving the line didn't fool the Germans, but it did fool de Coverley. So because that was the whole thing. Major was like, I can't do anything. Go talk to Coverly. Like, he's the main guy. But he moved ahead to the front line and then is never heard from again for the rest of the story. This is also where a poignant point that comes in. And Yossarian's like, the enemy is anybody who's going to get you killed no matter what side he's on. He's a lot more hard-nosed and a lot less crazy.
Yeah.
Even though this is the middle of the book, quote, at the beginning of the story. Half-Oat decides he's going to die of pneumonia.
He decides?
Yeah, he's like, I'm going to die of pneumonia. And they're wondering whatever happened to Captain Flume. Somebody's like, I saw him in the woods eating berries.
Oh, terrified.
And then Hungry Joe has this
lost his mind.
Hungry Joe has this whole situation with this cat. Because he's like, this cat is sleeping on my face and suffocating me. And so they're like, well, they got to fight. So they form this. Hungry Joe and this cat are gonna fight, and they set up the rules. They're like, fists and fangs only, no guns, and they mention to Joe, and no spitting, and they talk to the cat. And they're like, you need to break clean in the clinches and go, and the cat just runs off. But the cat comes into play later. So they bomb Bologna, but Yossarian doesn't. He turns back around. And then they're like, well, no, you have to go back. You didn't fight. So then he has to go back, gets shot at, and we learn that this particular situation is when Snowden dies. But we still don't get all the particulars of it. But it's this thing that he's kind of suppressing. Yep. So then he gets rest leave in Rome because of this mission and how frenetic it was. He meets this beautiful Italian woman. Cathcart raises the number of missions to 40, so we know that this happened in the past. And this is when Yossarian admits himself to the hospital. We're repeating some of the same stories again. The guy in the cast shows up, and they're like, maybe it's Mud, we realize now, like, oh, well, that's the dead guy that just showed up and then was dead in 2 hours and then came back. So, like, maybe that's the cast guy. And then we see how Snowden ended up being Yossarian's unraveling, because this is actually the true start of the story, where Yossarian thinks about how everyone is out to get him and how unfair war is and all of that stuff. And then this is the start of when the chaplain is suspected of signing Washington Irving on him, because we remember the chaplain was there at the beginning of the story when Yossarian was bored and pretending to. So now all of these pieces are coming back together. So then we have Cathcart raising it up to 60. And there's this character, Dobbs, who's like, well, I want to kill Cathcart. What's the scheme on this? Right? Yossarian is on the fence about it. Milo now has this massive enterprise syndicate, which just comes out of nowhere in one of these chapters, because Yossarian goes off with him. And he is the mayor of Palermo. He's the governor of Malta. He's the vice Shah of Oran. The Caliph of Baghdad, the Sheikh of Arabia, and he's worshipped as a god in parts of Africa. They go in there. There's banners bearing Milo's picture with his unfortunate mustache. Sobbing women. Sobbing women reach up to touch his shoulder. He showers the crowds in foil-covered Hershey kisses, chanting, Milo, Milo.
This is in the show. And it's pretty incredible.
And this is the only time, really, that it opens up to the real world.
Right.
And there are planes bearing M&M Enterprise. He has, coerced these governments to let him use their Air Force planes. He contracts
everyone. Yeah. I mean, he laid bare how easily everyone can be manipulated, and how easy it can, if you just wield the power, you can get anything done.
Yeah, and he also goes...
It's also fragile, and people, we want to pretend like, we're born to be this, or I was supposed to do this. So he just found it and made it happen, and we all know somebody like that who just made an industry out of nowhere, and then look, they're the czar of Kazakhstan. Yeah, it's hilarious. This character is so funny, and they do a really good job in the show with it.
Good. Yossarian tries to make sense of how did all this happen? And Milo,
and as the audience, you're right there with you're just like, this is so infuriating almost to a point where you're just like, out of everybody, everyone in this entire war trying to clamor for agency, and this kid found it and he just created it.
Yeah, and so Milo starts explaining it, and this is a long diatribe in the book that's just total nonsense, because he's talking about quarter shares of the price of eggs and how everybody owns a piece. But then Yossarian figures out in his logic that Milo is the middleman, but he's also selling back to himself. It's like, how are you making any money off of this? But none of it matters, except for at the point where he's getting contracts from the Germans, and some of Milo's guns were the ones that shot down Mud, which is Yossarian's dead roommate who never appears. This is the only time in this story about war that the enemy is mentioned. The Germans are not mentioned in any other point in the story except for where Milo recruits them to be his guns.
Intersects with the military-industrial complex of the enemy.
Yeah,
that's
it's not. There's no it's not an anti. Like, he was not necessarily against World War II. He was against the systems in place orchestrating.
Yeah.
So then
how the sides are you're just manipulated and against other people's interests. It's the people cheering in Bulgaria or wherever he became the mayor. It's like, has no idea he's actually the cook at the airfield, and he's 18 or whatever. So it's in this funny example you get to, while as the audience with Yo-Yo, how are we going to have agency? How are we going to matter? How are we going to survive? And then to watch some kid just create his own reality in the middle of it all and just wield it. It's inspiring and infuriating all at the same time, but it speaks far more to the system than it does to Milo. It's not. I'm not mad at I'm more the bureaucracy of the system. It's really
how capitalism works in this way, and then how it affects this individual person. This guy who never even got a chance, and he's dead in his tent before he even gets to fight.
Exactly. He was supposed to be a doctor, and just because he didn't get checked in right, but Milo the cook gets to, but yeah, because it's all me. So I then, as the audience, I just am reinforced all the time in Yo-Yo's point of view of how do I make sure I'm not Snowden.
Yeah.
How do I make sure I'm not just lining up to be the next person knocked down? You get enforced on that point of view all the way around when he tries to poke holes in the bureaucracy and the meaninglessness of it all.
So this now cuts to a flashback, which we know now because we're tracking kind of now with the narrative. Yossarian is sitting naked in a tree.
Casual.
And we realize that this is Snowden's funeral. The chaplain sees him, thinks it's some creepy vision because he also encountered this wild man living in the forest, which we know is Flume. And doubts everything about spirituality and morals and all of that stuff. Yossarian is put in the hospital again. This is the next time, and he decides with Dunbar, who's his friend, to switch places with these young people, and gets this close to being considered crazy because he says he's dreams about holding a live fish, and they're like, "What fish? Which hand?" And Dunbar's like, "Well, it varies with the fish." And they're like, "How do you know?" And Dunbar's like, "Well, I'm in the dream."
Oh my gosh.
And then they decree that Yossarian is crazy. And he's like, hurrah! But then,
finally,
because he switched identities with these young people when they first got into the hospital, they're like, no, it's that guy's the one that's going home. Yossarian, you're going back out there to fight.
Got him.
So then he's like, way back when Dobbs was like, we want to kill Cathcart, he's like, let's do it. Let's kill him. Because now at this point, Dobbs has done 60 missions.
Good Lord.
Or, who is his roommate, makes allusions to the fact that he's leaving somehow, and Yossarian gets the word that he crashed his plane somewhere and has disappeared. Now we're at the end game here, where we have a lot of deaths that start happening, as well as a lot of bureaucratic promotions and shifting around in the system that completely upend what's going on, and it all happens at once. So now this Scheisskopf guy who's obsessed with the parades gets moved and can't do parades anymore, and that's how he ends up in the war in a flashback. Even though it's a flashback, we're like, oh, this is happening now because, like I said, of the structure. So it's still like change of hands, things are going on, but it's a flashback. McWatt is the guy that flies too low. He ends up killing this guy with propellers, which is a big part in the series, I'm sure. And it's kind of gross. And then he kills himself. Cathcart raises the missions to 65.
Yeah, that whole sequence is pretty crazy. They do a really good job with it too.
Yeah. So Doc Danica is also killed in the crash, but he's not because he was listed as being on that plane from way back in the beginning when he had so many flights to do.
Mm-hmm.
So now everybody's acting like he's dead because he's quote-unquote dead on the records because he was on the plane.
Right.
And so he has to be dead. Otherwise, he was lying about being on the planes and none of the missions that he went on.
Right.
So he's dead. So people are avoiding any conversation with him.
Right.
Because they don't want to tell him that he's dead.
Right.
You know? Just insanity. So it's this weird duality between the two people, Mud, the guy that is the actual dead guy who's there, and then Doc, who's not dead, but is there.
Look how bureaucracy can even mess up the finality of something like death.
They tell his wife, who gets a bunch of money and starts meeting new men in the USA, he reaches out to his wife, but then she also gets letters from Colonel Cathcart saying that this is an imposter. We've had Washington Irving show up in a bunch of our stuff, and we think that this is who it is, and your husband is dead. And so she moves to Lansing, Michigan, and changes her address, and he doesn't hear anything.
Oh my God!
Yeah. Now that Orr is gone, who is the crab apples in his cheeks guy, Yossarian gets new roommates. He wants Half-Oat to join him, but Half-Oat says that he's going to die of pneumonia still, and so he's not going to join him.
Okay.
All right. They move Mud's stuff, which is troubling to Yossarian.
Mm.
He flees to Rome with Hungry Joe, which they did before when they met this Italian woman. There's this guy Nately, which I wasn't too interested in, but he has these brothels and women of the night that he's involved in off, kind of. He's always in Rome for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Trolloping about with them. He wants to be done because they've formed a bond and he wants to take this Italian woman back to America with him. Yossarian ends up dealing with that situation, goes back, and there's the man in white in the cast that's back.
Right.
After he's died. They say he's lost inches and he's gained weight, but he's back. And now the chaplain's in the hospital pretending to be sick.
Yeah.
And this nurse says that they plan to disappear Dunbar, who is his friend, and Yossarian's like, what the hell does that even mean? It's not even good grammar.
I know.
But like I said, this Nately guy, now he has 70 missions done, and he won't go home unless he can figure out how to get this Italian girl to come home with him. The chief dies of pneumonia. Milo...
And there he goes.
...is able to get out of his flying missions because he explains his situation is just so confusing.
Right.
But he needs somebody to do missions in his stead, so they up the missions to 80, and right after they do that, Nately, which is the guy that wants the Italian woman to go with him, and Dobbs, the guy that wanted to kill Cathcart, both die on the missions after they bump it up to 80. So now the chaplain is on one of these kangaroo trial courts for forgery for being Washington Irving. But now the lieutenant...
Are you Washington Irving, son?
Now also General Scheifskopf, who was the parades guy, got promoted all the way up to lieutenant general. So now he's in charge of all combat operations. And they're so worried, and what you normally would think of like, oh no, there's this dictatorial general who's going to take over and add more missions. They're just all worried because he's just making every man march in parades. Like, that's how power corrupts in this society. This is the final part, which is Yossarian is now walking backwards all the time to make sure no one is after him.
Natural.
And they take him to Rome because he's so unhinged and is affecting the rest of the people who are now becoming more sane, and he's becoming more crazy. The widow, quote-unquote, of Nately tries to stab him in Rome because she blames him, which is an interesting parallel of, like, this is her only connection to the war, is any soldier who's involved in it, and so he should take the blame for it and die, because that's all she knows. Takes a huge tonal shift and just all of these graphic, horrible elements in Rome. People being raped, killed, murdered, disease, all that stuff. And then the irony is that the police arrest him for not having a pass to be in Rome, as opposed to all of this other stuff that's going on.
All the rape and murder happening.
This gruesome night of injustice.
Hey, you can't be here. There's a screaming lady around the corner.
He goes back after seeing all of that, and the top generals say, well, we can send you home if, forget Catch-22, if you agree to like us, and like go along with us and be one of the boys, then we'll get you back home. And so Yossarian is like, cool, sounds good. As he's exiting, the Italian woman is pretending to be a private in the army and stabs him. So then he goes back to the hospital for actually being incapacitated with something.
Well, in the series, it all comes to a head in Rome. I forget the name of who commits it, but one of his pilot buddies ends up raping and murdering a girl.
Yeah, that's in part of this, all these details. Yeah.
That, coupled with Snowden happening all kind of towards the end of it all, really breaks Yo-Yo.
So this is what happens in the book as well. Yeah, he's now, after the Italian lady has stabbed him and he's in the hospital for a legitimate reason, recounts, this is when we learn about Snowden's death most graphically and why Yossarian wants to live so much, because he recognizes that's all that's there is a human life. And he also realizes everybody's dead. Like, as I've been saying, all of the people, not all 65 characters, but all of the people in his thing have died in some fashion. And he's like, oh no, except for Hungry Joe. And then the chaplain's like, no, he died in his sleep with a cat on his face. Which is what he was worried about that whole time.
It got him. It got him.
Now everybody's done. So now...
The cat got him. It ran away from the fight, but it wasn't one out. It was the cat that people needed to be looking out for in the middle of the night. Came up and smothered that piece. Clocked him out.
Clocked him. So now Yossarian's like, I can't do this. I can't sell myself short for all of these people that have died. And the chaplain says that they found Orr and he's washed up in Sweden. His old roommate that said he was going to leave and they thought he crashed way at the beginning, that started the glut of all people dying.
No.
So he's like, I'm going to desert, and that's what I'm going to do. And they're like, you've just got to jump. And then they go, jump! And because right as he's leaving the hospital, he avoids the prostitute lady that tries to stab him again as he's leaving the hospital, and he takes off, running towards who knows where. Sweden, we presume, but it's not made clear. And that's how the book ends. And so I felt like at the very end, her attack is a metaphor for, like, you're facing the troubles, but now you're escaping them in the right way. Like, you still have to atone for what you're doing, but you're able to move past them. And so the whole final point of the book as well is the ultimate catch-22, which he comes to realize is that life is not worth living if you don't care about others, but caring about others is what endangers your life. So he finds the middle ground of doing neither, which is walk away. He doesn't become the commander and become one of the boys, but he also doesn't fight in the war.
Yo, I'm identifying with this heavily right now. That's a walk away. I really like that.
And sometimes that is, and still face your troubles and consequences.
Yeah.
But you don't have to be involved in the system.
Right.
And your life is also important.
Right.
So the thing about Joseph Heller, like I said, this book took him 8 years to write, but the next book was not until 1974, 13 years later. And it's called Something Happened, became a #1 New York Times bestseller. 5 more books after that. Taught creative writing at some colleges in the meantime. But they all follow these themes of bureaucracy and the systems that go into play. Something Happened is about an advertising executive that's life falls apart by the titular Something Happened.
Yeah.
And how that system messes with people and post-traumatic stress.
That'd be interesting,
in those scenarios. The Office life.
Oh, that'd be interesting. We ought to do that sometime down the road.
And then there was some other books that came out, and then there was a sequel to this book, Catch-22, that came out in 1994.
1994.
Called Closing Time. And it is based in New York City in the 1990s and follows Yossarian and some other characters. Milo's in there a little bit. And what it deals with is death in the same way, but in terms of old age, cancer. He said this is the only book that he's written, this Closing Time, that has 3-dimensional characters. He's like, the other ones are all allegories or pretty flat. Like, these are characters that are growing and changing. And there are references, even meta-references in Closing Time to Catch-22, where, like, Yossarian's kid asks if he ever went to Sweden, And Yossarian says that only happens in the movies. So it's the fallout, because he was like, the time was different when I wrote this in the 60s than it is now, and I want to talk about what it would be like for somebody to go through this in World War II when they're 70, and what their life is like, and encountering the same obstacles about death and life and choice. And it's called Closing Time.
That sounds really good.
Closing. That's all I think about is that song. The thing about Closing Time is that there's a character, and I had to do a little internet weaving to piece this together.
Some beaming and bobbing.
But noble listeners will hopefully appreciate this if you've listened to some other episodes in terms of connections between what we've already learned. There's a character called Joey in Closing Time.
Yeah.
That's an older guy, and he has Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Okay.
Which, if that rings a bell, I looked up, and Joseph Heller, this Joey character is based on him. He actually had this in the 80s for a year, and the reason it's familiar is because it's what Dr. Seuss's first wife had. That horrible disease that rendered her, it like messes with your nerves and affects your breathing, and she was in an iron lung, and then she died or committed suicide because of it. So Joseph Heller had this disease because nobody knows how it happens. It just hits you, and then it deteriorates you.
Wow.
So he had it in the 80s, wrote a book about it. Because he beat it. He recovered from it over a year. The book is called
Knock him out.
The book is called No Laughing Matter, and it's about his struggle and recovery because of his friends and his family and people that supported him and dealing with it.
Oh, cool.
Some of his friends...
Ooh, that'd be good.
Some of his friends that appear in the book are Mel Brooks, the famous director who did Blazing Saddles. Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather.
No way,
was one of his friends.
What in the world?
Yeah. So that's a book called No Laughing Matter, which is kind of a memoir of that particular time in his life, but is also related to one of the characters in Closing Time. The last book he ever...
I swear, if you were making content in the 70s and 80s, you could just about meet anybody. Anybody could be your friend. Because think about it now. Because now everybody has the access to just make any content they want and put it out and distribute it. But back then, no. And so if you were actually making content and putting it out, you were of really what was a small club. And so whether you were doing TV or film and somebody else is doing radio or, public access to you, it's like you were all making content. And so you would be able to meet. I find that stuff fascinating. I watch documentaries about that all the time, like Club 54 and stuff, like blah, blah, blah. Anyway.
No, it does all connect together.
It's wild.
And so the last thing that connects together, his last book that he wrote, since he died in 1999, was called Portrait of an Artist as an Old Man. So there's a James Joyce book, I think, called Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And he's referencing that. But this book, Portrait of an Artist as an Old Man, is a novel about an old guy trying to match the success of his earlier work in a novel. Because that's all,
funny.
That's all he was really, he's written these other things, and they took a long time in between. But he's the Catch-22 guy.
Well, man, if any of these books are as engaging as this, I'm down any time. They sound thought provoking, and if they're of the
similar
same
themes, guy,
if they're of the same air, if he has that same kind of just turn a cheek, turn phrase, fun with them, man, this would be I want to get into it more. It seems like any one of these books sounds incredible. Yeah, this is wild. I never expected this to be this much fun. I always thought of it as being something that was going to thought-provoking, but more so on the depressing side and more the heavy. And it certainly is.
Yeah.
But it is engaging and fun to read and has you laughing even when the most horrible things are happening.
It's a perspective on life, and I appreciate it
and
because
I identify
a lot of the literature that you see that is revered is because of the dramatic nature of it and how deep and intense and soul-wrenching the way that it's presented, these huge moments in a person's life, and all of the grandiosity that comes with a piece of literature, which this has, but the tone that it takes for it is like maybe laugh about it.
Yeah.
Maybe find a way to find the absurdity in it and then reveal the truth, as opposed to find a way to find the horror in it and reveal the truth. It's just a different way of doing it that you don't see in most of the other New York Times top 100 American books of all time.
And it's just a personal thing. When I'm in the middle of something, I'm always trying to find the fun in it. I'm always, that's why in this book, I'm like, yeah, if I was in this situation, I think I would interpret these situations a little more like these characters opposed to all the other ones. But when I sit down to be creative and when I sit down to write, I'm much more on the heavier side. Whereas when me in real life, even in the middle of the duress, I'm still cracking a joke like in this book. So that's how I really identify with and see exactly how this stuff would play out in real life. I mean, it is totally over the top, except it is not. People are like this, and it can be this desperate. It can.
It's one of the types of comedy where you just have, if you accept that this is what happens in the world, that's why it's funny.
Right.
Nobody else is questioning that Captain Flume is hiding out in the forest. That's just a part of this world. And so it's hilarious. But it's also kind of true.
But no, and it is. I mean, all these characters that have all these quirks and go off and do all these, all these insane things. Milo somehow creates an entire industry and becomes a czar of whatever. Yeah. It's like Flume's off in the woods hiding from somebody who said he was going to kill him in the night. Like Hungry
Joe dies with a cat on his face.
Right. No,
what he's most afraid of.
Who they set up like a boxing match ring with. It's like, but every one of these stories, I have a personal experience either in school or, on a project, something like that, where I've experienced something tangentially peripheral just like that. Mm-hmm. It's such a breath of fresh air to finally, understand this a bit more, because I always kind of lumped it in with all the other war material. I always knew it was the counterculture of it. Right. Yeah. I always knew it is of all of this material. It is the counterculture version of it, but I never expected it to be this in-your-face satirical.
It's also like with the other classics that we talked about, Handmaid's Tale, Pride and Prejudice, or bigger pieces of work. It's hard to create them in a new medium. Like I think you could get the tone and the whatever, like we talked about with Watchmen, but to fully realize it's one of the few books that has 65 characters and none of them are minor characters. Each of them has all the same amount of time in the sun.
Which is so interesting that later on he says that the Closing Time is the only one with three-dimensional characters, because just in the little briefest of explanations he might give on some of these 65 characters, they feel so... I get their motivations, it's very strong. So now I'm wondering, well, what does he, if these are 2D to him, what is a 3D character to him?
Yeah, what is
so now I'm like, and I get to go, so if he thinks Yo-Yo in this book is 2D, what is he like 3D,
when he's
years down the road?
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe down the line, maybe we'll have another episode.
Yeah.
Well, this was fascinating. Thank you so much, Taylor.
You're welcome so much, Evan.
Catch-22. Y'all go pick it up.
Watch the Hulu.
It's real good. Yeah. So
next week we're
doing 1775
for
our patriotic July 4th episode.
You don't think it's about 1776?
Not 1776, the little known year before, the lead up to what nobody talks about. And that's what we're doing.
Yep. So enjoy your weekend. Or whenever you listen to this.
Back at you next week. Thanks for listening. Later.
See y'all. I did want to tell you, I missed this because it had nothing to do with anything, but in the filming of the Hulu series with George Clooney, I looked up just if there was anything that happened, and he got in this horrible scooter accident on the way to set. Where he
Please tell me it was a Lime.
No, it was like a moped.
Oh,
They're filming in Italy.
Oh.
And he was driving himself on his way to set and just smashed into the front of this Mercedes. There is closed circuit television footage from a camera on the street of this. It looks devastating. He just head like nose to nose into this car who doesn't turn. His head flies into the windshield, cracks it, flings forward. It's George Clooney. And they're like, oh yeah, minor injuries. He's back on set.
I gotta see.
Oh, he could have died.
I have to see this footage.
Yeah,
this is incredible.
But if that gets in there, that'll be my little tag.
You should put that in. That's really, really fun.